The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Margaret Hale read it standing up because her legs refused to carry her to a chair. Her hands shook. The words blurred. She had known this truth about herself for 3 years, known it the way a person knows a scar is permanent, but seeing it written by a doctor's hand made it real in a way nothing else had. She folded the paper carefully, tucked it inside her apron, walked out to the porch, and sat down in the dust. Not on the steps, in the dirt. Like the ground was the only thing honest enough to hold her. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Margaret's journey all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The town of Harrow, Wyoming did not forgive easily. It was the kind of place where a person's reputation arrived before they did, and outlasted them by decades. Merchants kept long memories. Wives kept longer ones. And when a young woman walked down Main Street with a body that drew whispers the way a candle drew moths, she learned fast that silence was safer than conversation. Margaret Hale had learned that lesson at 14. She was 24 now, and she had not forgotten a single word of it. She was beautiful. Anyone honest enough to look past the first glance knew that. Her face was soft and square-jawed, with dark brown eyes that caught light the way still water did, and a mouth that curved up naturally at the corners, even when she was trying not to smile. Her hair was thick and the color of chestnuts, and she kept it braided because loose hair drew comments she did not need. She was broad across the shoulders and full through the hips and waist, carrying a heaviness in her body that the women of Harrow called shameful, and that Margaret had simply learned to call herself. She moved through the world apologetically, angled sideways through doors, chose the chair at the end of the table, wore dark colors because someone had told her once, her mother, God rest her, that dark colors made a person look smaller and smaller, was better and better, meant less trouble. She ran the dry goods store her father had left her when he died, and she ran it well. The books were clean. The shelves were organized. She extended credit to families who were struggling and kept no public record of it because humiliating a man in front of his neighbors over a debt was bad for everybody. She knew every customer by name. She knew which children were sick and which husbands were drinking and which harvests had failed. People liked Margaret Hale. They just didn't respect her. There was a difference, and she had learned it the hard way. It was a Wednesday morning in the late summer of 1882 when the trouble found her. Not trouble in the abstract. Margaret had learned to live with abstract trouble, the whispers and the sideways looks and the way men's eyes slid past her like she was a fence post. This was specific trouble, the kind that walked in through the front door of the store and announced itself. His name was Gerald Whitmore, and he was the son of the richest man in Teller County. He came in the way men like him always came in: too much room taken up, not enough regard paid. He knocked a display of canned goods sideways without stopping to look, let his boots track mud across the clean floor, and leaned his elbow on the counter like he was settling in for a long and comfortable stay. "Miss Hale," he said. Margaret was behind the counter entering figures in the ledger. She did not look up immediately. She finished the line she was writing, capped the pen, and then looked up. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. He was 28 and handsome in a way that had always been given to him rather than earned. Broad forehead, square chin, the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion mattered to him. He had proposed to Margaret 8 months ago, and she had turned him down, and he had not entirely forgiven her for that, though he told everyone in town that he had been the one to withdraw his offer. "Came to see about that order of seed corn," he said. "It came in on Thursday," Margaret said. "Your father's men picked it up Friday." "Did they?" He drummed his fingers on the counter. "You sure about that?" "I keep records, Mr. Whitmore." "Right." He straightened and looked around the store with the lazy, evaluating gaze of a man who was about to say something he had been saving up. "You know, Miss Hale, folks in town were talking." "Folks in town are always talking. About you specifically." He picked up a jar of preserves from the nearest shelf and turned it in his hands without looking at it. "About how you turned down my proposal." Margaret's jaw tightened. She kept her face still. "I wasn't aware that was still a topic of conversation." "Oh, it is." He set the jar down. People think it's peculiar. A woman in your situation turning down a good offer. He paused to let that land. Your situation being what it is. My situation, she repeated evenly. Big woman, no family left, running a store on your own. He shrugged, and the shrug said everything the words did not. Beggars can't be choosers. That's what folks say. The store was quiet. Margaret was aware of two other customers, Mrs. Pendleton by the fabric bolts. Old Mr. Carver near the back, who were very carefully not looking at either of them and very carefully listening to everything. I appreciate you stopping by about the corn, Margaret said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steady for years. Is there anything else I can help you with today? You know what your problem is, Margaret. Don't, she said quietly. You think too highly of yourself. His voice wasn't cruel exactly. It was something worse than cruel. It was amused. A woman built the way you are can't afford to be choosy. You had one good offer and you threw it away. My father wanted that merger between the store and our land would have set you up comfortable for life. But you said no because you thought you deserved better. He leaned on the counter again. You don't. Mrs. Pendleton had set down the fabric she was examining. Old Mr. Carver had gone very still. Margaret Hale stood behind the counter of her father's store, with her hands flat on the ledger, and she did not cry, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not reach for the flour scoop on the shelf behind her, which she wanted to do with a conviction that surprised her. Mr. Whitmore, she said, the seed corn was delivered Friday. Your receipt is on file. If you need a copy, I can provide one. Otherwise, I need to ask you to leave. He stared at her for a moment. Something flickered in his face, not respect. Not quite, but something close to the memory of what respect was supposed to feel like. He left without another word. Mrs. Pendleton appeared at the counter 3 minutes later, her voice low and urgent. Don't you listen to a word of that, dear. He is a vile little man. Thank you, Mrs. Pendleton. His mother was the same way, superior airs, as if money were a virtue. How much fabric were you looking at? Margaret. I'm fine, she said. And because she had been saying it for 10 years, it came out smooth and practiced, and completely unconvincing. How much fabric? Mwitiek. After Gerald Whitmore left, old Mr. Carver appeared from the back of the store. He was 73 and had been coming in since her father opened it. He stood near the stove with his hat in his hands and didn't say anything for a long moment. Some men, he said finally, are the way they are because nobody ever loved them right. And some men are the way they are because everybody loved them too much and too easy. He put his hat back on. That boy is the second kind. I know, Mr. Carver. Don't let him make you feel small, Margaret. I won't, she said. He paid for his tobacco and left. She let herself feel small for exactly 3 minutes. Then she squared her shoulders and went back to the ledger. She was good at that, the deliberate return to ordinary things after the world knocked her sideways. It was not the same as being fine. It was the architecture that kept her upright while she waited to feel fine again. The afternoon moved on. Customers came and went. She charged a young mother a little less than she should have and made a note in the column she kept for such adjustments. 2 young men came in for tobacco and left without buying anything, muttering something she didn't quite catch but understood perfectly by the way they glanced back at her. She understood it very well. She had always understood it very well. She locked the store at 6, turned the sign, and walked home the long way through the south end of town, where the road ran along the creek for a 1/4 mile. She did this when she needed the quiet. The creek had no opinions about her. The cottonwood trees had nothing to say about her worth or what she deserved. They were simply there, and the world was bearable along that stretch of road in a way it was not always bearable elsewhere. She let herself think about the doctor's letter, and then she let herself stop because there was supper to make, and she could not afford to stand still long enough to let grief catch all the way up. She made supper without tasting. It washed the dishes and sat down at the kitchen table with the letter. She had read it 4 times. She had read it 4 times because the first time she thought she had misunderstood it, And the second time, she had hoped she'd misread a word. And the third time, she was certain. And the fourth time, she was trying to decide what the certainty meant. Dr. Albright had been kind. He had used careful language, the kind doctors used when they were trying to soften something that could not be softened. The fever 3 years ago, the one that had nearly killed her and had taken 3 weeks to break, had left damage. Internal. Permanent. The specific word he used was irreparable. She would not be able to have children. She was 24 years old, and she would not be able to have children, and she sat in her kitchen in the quiet of the evening and tried to locate what she felt about that. It was complicated what she felt. She had not spent her whole life dreaming of motherhood the way some women did, but she had assumed it would be possible. The way you assumed breathing would be possible. The letter removed that assumption. She thought about Gerald Whitmore's words in the store that morning. A woman in your situation. She had understood him to mean her body, her size, her aloneness. Now the phrase had new weight. A different situation than she had thought she was in. She folded the letter again and put it in the box under her bed, where she kept things she was not ready to think about. She was not ready to think about it. She was thinking about it constantly. 2 weeks passed. She ran the store. She extended credit to the Kowalski family when their harvest came in thin. She declined 3 invitations to supper at the Pendletons because she could not sit across a table from a woman who pitied her without wanting to scream. She was in the back room doing inventory on a Thursday afternoon when she heard the bell above the door. "Be right with you," she called. She came out wiping her hands on her apron and stopped. The man standing in her doorway was not from Harrow. She knew every person in Harrow by sight, and many by their walk from a distance, and this man was none of them. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the kind of tall that men exaggerated about themselves with a ranginess to his build that said he spent most of his days in the saddle. He wore a weathered brown hat that had seen considerable use and a canvas coat with the collar turned up against the wind. He had a jaw that looked like it had been made out of something harder than bone, and lines at the corners of his eyes and mouth that came from years outdoors rather than from laughter. Though they gave the impression that laughter was not entirely foreign to him. He was, Margaret noted with a mental step sideways, quite remarkably good-looking. In the way that certain men were good-looking, the way certain horses were good-looking, built for actual use, not for show. He was looking around the store with the quiet, methodical attention of a man who took inventory of spaces out of habit. "Good afternoon," Margaret said. He looked at her. Not at her body, at her face. The distinction was one she had learned to notice immediately because most men's eyes went to her body first instinctively, the way a person's eyes go to a splinter in their thumb. This man's eyes went to her face and stayed there. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "I'm hoping you can help me out. Just rode in from the north. Need a few supplies. Feed dried goods, maybe some rope if you carry it." "We carry all of that," she said, moving behind the counter. "How much feed are you looking for?" 3 bags if you have it. Oats." "We have it. Ride in alone." "Yes, ma'am." "Long ride from the north. Where you headed?" He paused, not suspicious, just measuring. "South of here. Heard there's work at the Calloway Ranch if a man shows up before fall." Margaret knew the Calloway Ranch. She knew the owner, Tom Calloway, a fair man, honest, the kind who actually paid what he promised and only let men go when the season genuinely ended. "He's still taking on hands," she said. "Should be another few weeks before he's full up." "Good to know." He moved along the shelves, studying them with the same quiet attention he'd given the room. She started pulling down the items he'd mentioned, keeping her movements efficient. Passing through Harrow before, or just stopping for supplies? Just supplies, most likely. He set a sack of dried beans on the counter. "Though it's a nice enough town." "People in town are kind," she said, and because she was not a liar, it was one of the few vanities she allowed herself, she added, "mostly." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Mostly," he repeated. "What's your name, Mr. "Callahan," he said. "Reese Callahan." "Margaret Hale." She extended her hand across the counter automatically the way she did with any new customer, and he took it without hesitation and shook it once firmly, the way you'd shake a man's hand, not the way men sometimes took women's hands like they were made of china. "Miss Hale," he said. "Mrs." She said her standard deflection. She was not a Mrs. She had learned years ago that Mrs. moved men to a slightly different category of behavior, one that was marginally more useful to her. It was a small dishonesty she had made her peace with. She rang up his items. He paid in coin without complaint or negotiation, which she always noted as a mark in a person's favor. She was wrapping the rope in oilcloth when he spoke again. "You're the owner." "Yes." "Run it yourself." "Yes." He nodded, absorbing this without commentary. Most men had something to say about it, either approving in a way that felt patronizing, or disapproving in a way that was more honest about what it was. He said nothing, which was the most respectful response she had encountered. She handed him the bundle. He tucked it under his arm. "Good to meet you, Mrs. Hale," he said. He touched the brim of his hat and was gone. Margaret stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed. Then she went back to the inventory. He came back on Saturday. She was behind the counter when he came in, and she saw him before he saw her, which gave her a moment's advantage she didn't entirely know what to do with. He pulled off his hat when he came through the door, not for her specifically, just general courtesy, and raked a hand through dark hair that was a little too long and slightly damp at the temples, as if he'd been working. "Mr. Callahan," she said. He looked up, and she had the impression that he was relieved to have located her, though she couldn't have said why she thought that. "Mrs. Hale, I was hoping you'd be in." "It's my store," she said. "I'm generally in." "Right." He approached the counter with a canvas sack over one shoulder. "I've been working out at the Cowboy place. Rode into town this morning." He set the sack on the counter. "And I need to make good on something." She looked at the sack. "What is that?" "Fence supplies." He reached into the sack and pulled out a box of nails, then a length of wire coil. "I rode past your place on the South Road Thursday morning. You've got a section of fencing down on the creek side. Good-sized gap." Margaret went still. "I know," she said slowly. "I've been meaning to see to it." "Figured." He set the wire down. "I fixed it." She looked at him. "I beg your pardon." "Fixed the fence. Took about an hour." He met her eyes steadily without apology and without the expectation of praise. "Had the supplies in my kit from some work at Callaway's. Figured your animals would thank you for it sooner rather than later." She was quiet for a moment. Nobody fixed her fence. People didn't do that. People looked at her fence and looked away, and told each other that it was a shame a woman living alone couldn't manage her own property. Nobody fixed it. "Mr. Callahan," she said carefully, "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything." He was putting the nails back in the sack. "Supplies weren't mine to begin with. I borrowed them from Callaway's stock, and I've already squared it with Tom. And I'll tell you true, Mrs. Hale, I fixed it because it needed fixing, and I was there. That's the whole story." "Why tell me about it at all, if it's the whole story?" He paused, and then something that was definitely a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Because the alternative was you riding out to the creekside one morning and finding someone had been on your property without your knowledge, and I didn't figure you'd care for that." She considered this. "No," she admitted. "I wouldn't." "There we are." She looked at him across the counter. "Are you always this direct?" "I try to be." He settled his hat back on his head. "Gets me in trouble sometimes, but I've found it saves time in the long run." "I'll need to pay you for the materials." "Callaway's materials." "Callaway's call. Already settled." "Then I'll need to pay you for the time." "I've got steady work, Mrs. Hale. I don't need your money." He said it without arrogance, stated it the way he stated everything as a fact rather than a performance. She was not sure what to do with him. Men in Harrow were either trying to get something from her, or they were avoiding her entirely. This man was doing neither, and she hadn't realized until this moment how much she had organized her interactions around those two categories. "Thank you," she said. It came out more plainly than she intended. Without the professional warmth she usually deployed, just the plain word. "You're welcome," he said, just as plainly, and left. She did not think about him after that. She thought about him a great deal after that, which she recognized was a problem and tried to stop doing, and stopped, and then found herself doing it again at inconvenient moments in the middle of inventory. In the quiet stretch of evening when the store was closed and the house was very still, and she sat at the kitchen table with no particular task to occupy her hands. She was not a foolish woman. She had not spent her life building practical walls around herself only to knock them down over a man who had fixed a fence and told the truth about it. But the thing was that the fence had been down for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of people walking past it and saying nothing, or saying something that amounted to nothing, or shaking their heads at the evidence of her inability to manage. And one man had seen it and fixed it and told her he'd done it because it needed doing. She thought about that. She tried not to. The following Wednesday, she was sweeping the porch in the early morning when she heard boots on the steps and looked up to find Reese Callahan, hat in hand, standing at the foot of the steps. He was wearing a clean shirt. She noted this involuntarily. "Morning," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan. Supplies?" "Not today." He looked at the hat in his hands, then up at her. "I was wondering if you'd care to walk over to the hotel dining room for supper this evening." Margaret stopped sweeping. The street was not empty. It was never empty at this hour. Merchants opening delivery carts, moving women going to market with their baskets. She was aware peripherally of Mrs. Harkins across the street, pretending to arrange a window display. She looked at Reese Callahan. He was looking at her with the same steady, direct attention he'd given the store on the first day and every exchange since. Not nervous, not performing, just asking. "Mr. Callahan," she said. She kept her voice even. "I appreciate the thought, I truly do, but I want to be honest with you about something." "I'd expect nothing less," he said. She set the broom against the rail. "I run a business in this town. A small town. People here, they see things and they talk about what they see. And the way they talk about women like me is—" She stopped, started again. "You're new here. You don't know yet what it costs a person to be talked about the wrong way. And I've been talked about the wrong way for a very long time." He listened to all of this without interruption. "Mrs. Hale," he said when she was done, "I'm asking you to supper, not proposing a scandal." He paused. "And I'll tell you something else. The thing people say about a woman, or don't say or say sideways, that's a fact about them, not about her. I learned that from my mother a long time ago, and I found it to hold up." She studied him. He didn't look away. "The hotel dining room," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am. Not before 7. I close up the store at 6, and I don't like to be rushed." The corner of his mouth moved. 7 o'clock, he said. "I'll be there." He put his hat back on, touched the brim, and walked back down the street. Across the road, Mrs. Harkins had completely stopped pretending to arrange the window. She almost didn't go. She stood in front of the small mirror in her bedroom at 6:45 and had a thorough conversation with herself about the entire undertaking. It lasted approximately 12 minutes and ended with her picking up her shawl and walking out the door because she was 24 years old, and she was not going to let fear make one more decision for her. The hotel dining room was the nicest eating establishment in Harrow, which was not saying much, but was saying something. White tablecloths and candles, and a woman who played the piano softly in the corner on Friday nights. It was a Wednesday. The piano was quiet. Reese Callahan was there at 7. Sitting at a corner table, hat on the chair beside him, hands folded on the table. He stood when she came in, which she had not expected, and pulled out the chair across from him, with the same matter-of-fact quality he brought to everything. They ordered. He asked for coffee first, which endeared him to her slightly, because she had never trusted men who didn't drink coffee. "How long have you been working at Calloway's?" she asked. "Going on 3 weeks now. Tom's a straight shooter." "He is. You're planning to stay through fall?" Through fall, maybe winter depending. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. You from here originally, Mrs. Hale? Born here. My father opened the store in 1855. She paused. 27 years ago. He passed 2 years ago. She looked at the table. My mother when I was 17. It's been just the store since then. Long time to run something alone. You learned to. He nodded. He didn't offer condolences, she noticed that. People always offered condolences a reflex, and it always felt like a door closing rather than opening. He simply acknowledged the fact of it and let it stand. What about you? She asked. Where are you from? Montana originally. Sometime in Texas before this. I move around. You have family. A sister in Bozeman. Parents are gone. He said it cleanly without self-pity. It's a good life moving. Suits me. Doesn't it get... She stopped. Lonely. He looked at her. Sometimes. He held her gaze. That's why a man makes an effort when he meets someone worth making an effort for. Margaret put down her fork. She looked at him carefully. He was not performing. She had spent enough time watching men perform various things at her performance of kindness, performance of disgust, performance of charity, to know the difference. Mr. Callahan, she said. Reese, he said. Reese. It felt strange in her mouth, familiar in a way that also frightened her. I need you to understand something about me. I'm listening. She took a breath. Not the breath she needed, not the one that would let her say the real thing, the thing in the letter, the thing she had been carrying for months, but the preliminary breath, the one that got you close enough. I am not easy to be around, she said. Not because of any particular fault in my character that I'm aware of, but because this town has decided since I was 14 years old what I am worth. And that decision has followed me like a weather system, and anyone who spends time near me walks into it. She looked at him steadily. I am telling you this not to warn you away, though you are welcome to consider yourself warned. I am telling you because I don't see the point of not telling you. He was quiet for a moment. The town of Harrow made a decision about you, he said slowly. And you're telling me that rather than argue with their decision, you've spent the better part of 10 years accommodating it. She opened her mouth, closed it. That's not what I said. That's what I heard. He said it without judgment, just observation, a man calling what he saw. I'm not faulting you for it. A person does what keeps them standing. But I'll tell you, Margaret. He used her name for the first time without asking permission, and she found she didn't mind. A town's opinion is not a fact, and the fact from where I'm sitting is that you're one of the sharpest, most capable women I've encountered in a long time, and the only weather system I can see is the one you carry yourself. The dining room was quiet around them. The candle between them made the shadows shift. You've known me 12 days, she said. I've known some people for 30 years and learned less, he said. She walked home alone. He offered to walk her and she declined, and he accepted the decline without argument, which was one more mark in his column, and she stood on the porch of her father's house in the warm Wyoming night and tried to be reasonable about everything. She was good at being reasonable. It was the primary skill she had developed alongside bookkeeping and the management of difficult personalities. She was less good at this particular thing. The thing that happened when someone looked at you directly and did not look away. She had very little experience with that and did not know exactly what it weighed. She went inside. She took the letter out of the box under her bed and read it once more the 5th time and put it away again. She lay in the dark and thought about the word irreparable and the way it sat in her chest like a stone that she had gotten used to the weight of mostly, but that was heavier tonight than it had been in a while. Because there was a man who had looked at her directly and had not looked away. And there was a fact about her that would make him look away. She was certain of it. She had been certain of it since the day the letter arrived. Whatever Reese Callahan was deciding to feel about Margaret Hale, whatever he thought he saw from where he was sitting, he had not yet seen the whole of her. And when he did, she thought pulling the quilt up against the night air, the looking away would happen. It always did. She was 24 years old, and she was already an expert in how things ended. She fell asleep still holding the certainty, like a stone, and did not notice not yet that stones grew lighter when a person stopped carrying them alone. She told herself it would stop. That was the reasonable thing, the thing she was good at. She told herself that Reese Callahan would ride out to the Callaway place work, the fall season, move on. South the way men like him moved, and that would be the natural end of whatever this was. A few conversations. A supper. A fence repaired. That was all it amounted to, and she was not the kind of woman who built castles out of a few kind words and a man who looked her in the eye. She told herself this on Thursday morning. On Thursday afternoon he came into the store. He did not buy anything. He came in, stood at the counter, asked her how the week had been, and listened to her answer with the focused attention of a man who was actually curious about it. He told her that one of Callaway's mares had foaled the night before a difficult birth, and that he'd been up most of the night with Tom's oldest boy keeping watch. He said the foal was small but standing, and that small and standing was all you needed. Small and standing, Margaret repeated. That's right. He held her gaze. Most things start that way. She didn't answer that. She didn't trust herself to. He left 20 minutes later with a tin of coffee and a bag of dried apples, the thinnest pretense for a visit she had ever witnessed, and she watched him go, and then stood very still behind the counter for a moment, before a customer came in and required her attention. Small and standing. She thought about that for the rest of the day. By Friday she had reorganized the east wall of shelving twice, which was something she only did when her mind was somewhere else and her hands needed occupation. Mrs. Pendleton came in for thread and noted the rearrangement with mild surprise. Spring cleaning, she said. Just keeping things orderly, Margaret said. Mrs. Pendleton looked at her the way older women sometimes looked at younger ones, when they knew perfectly well what was happening and were choosing to be kind about it. Mr. Callahan came in twice this week, she said, selecting her thread with great care. I happened to notice. He works nearby. It's convenient. I'm sure it is. She held a spool up to the light. He's a decent-looking man. Is he? Margaret said. I hadn't noticed. Mrs. Pendleton smiled at the thread. No, I'm sure you hadn't. She paid for her thread and left, and Margaret went back to reorganizing the east wall, which did not need reorganizing, and thought about convenience and decency and the precise quality of a man's eyes when he was actually listening. She admitted to herself in a certain amount of trouble. The question was what to do about it. The answer was nothing. The answer was to let it run its natural course, to be pleasant and professional, and let the man work out his season and move on and take this particular feeling with him when he went. She had survived every other thing. She would survive this. She was still deciding that on Saturday morning when Gerald Whitmore came back. He did not come alone this time. He came with two other men, both from his father's operation, both built along the same lines of comfortable entitlement, and they took up a good portion of the store in a way that was not entirely accidental. Miss Hale, he said. He had gone back to Miss, she noted, a small restaking of territory. Mr. Whitmore. She kept her hands on the counter. What can I get for you? We're looking for a case of lamp oil, our order from last month. He watched her with the kind of patience that wasn't really patience, the kind that was just waiting for an opening. That order's been ready for 3 days, she said. I sent word out. Word didn't reach us. He leaned on the counter, and one of the other men, a broad-shouldered one named Cale, who Margaret had always found slightly dangerous in the particular way that men without much imagination could be dangerous, moved to the side looking at the shelves. I'll have the boys loaded up. She started for the back. I heard you had supper at the hotel Wednesday, Whitmore said. She stopped. With that ranch hand, he continued. Callahan. She turned around. I did, she said. The store had two other customers in it, a woman she knew named Lucy Garrett, and old Mr. Finch, who was nearly deaf and therefore mercifully uninvolved. Lucy had gone very quiet near the fabric section. People thought that was interesting, Whitmore said. A woman like you, supper with a drifter. He works at Calloway's. For now. He straightened. Drifters don't stay, Margaret. That's rather the definition. Your lamp oil is in the back. I'll have it brought out. I'm not finished. You are, she said, and something in the way she said it made him go still for just a moment's surprise, because she did not usually push back this directly, and she was as surprised as he was by the evenness in her own voice. You are finished, Mr. Whitmore. I'll have your oil ready in 5 minutes. You're welcome to wait on the porch. He stared at her. Cale shifted his weight near the shelves. It's a shame. Whitmore said, his voice dropping just slightly, taking on a quality that she recognized as the voice he used when he wanted to make something sound like concern rather than cruelty. He doesn't know about you, does he? What the doctor said. What you can't. He let the sentence end there, open and ugly, and the space it left was worse than words. The room was very quiet. Margaret Hale gripped the edge of the counter and did not let go. Get out, she said. Both of you. Your oil will be on the porch. This time he went. He went because something in her face told him the conversation had found a wall, and Whitmore was not in. The end, a man who enjoyed resistance once it became real. He left, and Cale went with him, and the door swung shut. Lucy Garrett came to the counter immediately. Her face was white and furious. That man, she said, that absolute— I need a minute, Margaret said. Of course, take— Just a minute, she said, and she walked into the back room and stood between the shelves of lamp oil and flour sacks and breathed through her nose the way her father had taught her, getting her feet back under her. She took exactly 3 minutes. Then she brought the lamp oil out to the porch. She did not look to see if Whitmore was still nearby. She went back inside and helped Lucy Garrett find the fabric she was looking for and answered every question with her normal voice and said goodbye when Lucy left, and turned the sign on the door to closed at 5:30 because she could not manage the last half hour and she was not going to pretend she could. She stood in the empty store in the quiet and she thought about what Whitmore had said. He knows. Or he will. Harrow was not a large town. Harrow was the kind of town where a doctor's office had thin walls and people listened with great dedication. And when Reese Callahan found out when someone told him, or when she had to tell him herself, that Margaret Hale could not give a man children, he would weigh that against everything he thought he saw from where he was sitting, and the scale would tip the way it always tipped, and he would be decent about it. Probably because he seemed like a decent man, and decent men were kind when they withdrew. She knew how that went. She had not experienced it personally, not with this specific fact, but she had experienced the broader version of it the moment when someone decided that what she was didn't match what they needed, and she was intimately familiar with the shape of it. She picked up her shawl and went home. She did not cry until she was inside with the door closed, which she considered a minor personal victory. He found out on Monday. She did not know who told him, and she would not learn until later that it had been Cale Whitmore's man who had mentioned it casually outside the feed store to a group of men that included one of Calloway's other hands, who had mentioned it to Tom Calloway himself, who had said nothing beyond a single quiet word of reproach that Cale had ignored. She found out he knew because he came to the store Monday afternoon wearing the same work clothes and the same weathered hat and the same direct expression, and he sat down in the chair she kept near the stove for customers who needed to rest, and he said, "Someone told me something about you today." Margaret set down the pen she was holding. "All right," she said. "I want to hear it from you," he said. "Not because I need to hear it, because I think you deserve the chance to say it yourself." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest was doing something complicated. She had spent the weekend preparing for this, running through various versions of the conversation, none of which had started this way. "Sit down, Margaret," he said. Not Mr. Callahan this time, not Mrs. Hale, just her name and his. She came around the counter and sat in the other chair, the one she used when she was doing mending or reading the ledger in the afternoon light. 3 years ago, she said, "I had a fever. It lasted 3 weeks. It did a great deal of damage to certain—" She stopped. Started again, the way she always had to start again on this particular subject from the beginning, because there was no graceful way to come at it from the side. "I cannot have children, Mr. Callahan. The fever made certain of that. I received the doctor's formal confirmation a month ago, but I have known the probability of it for some time." The store was quiet. "That's what I know," he said. "Yes." "Is there more?" She looked at her hands. "I think you understand what that means for a woman here. What it means for—" She stopped again. "A man who wants a family. Who expects—" "I'm 38 years old," he said, "and I have never once sat across a table from a woman and thought about whether she could give me children." She looked up. "That is the truth," he said. "I'm not saying it to make you feel better about it. I'm saying it because it is a true statement about who I am, and you deserve to know who you're sitting across from." "Reese, I'm not finished." He leaned forward, his forearms on his knees, his eyes level with hers. "What I think about when I sit across a table from a woman when I sit across from you is whether she's the kind of person I want to know better, whether the time passes fast or slow, whether I want it to last longer." He held her gaze. "The time passes very fast with you, Margaret. I always want it to last longer. That is what I think about." She was quiet for a moment that stretched. Outside the store, a cart went past. Someone called a name down the street. The ordinary sounds of Harrow going about its afternoon. "You should know that people will talk," she said finally. "Let them. You don't understand yet what that means in a town like this. What it feels like to walk down a street where—" "I grew up in a town like this," he said. "Different states, same narrow minds. I understand exactly what it means." He sat back. "I'm still here." She studied him, looking for the performance, the thing she was trained to find. She could not locate it. There was just the chair and the afternoon light and a man telling her who he was with the same directness he applied to everything. "You're very sure of yourself," she said. "Not always." He almost smiled. "Right now, a little, yes." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "You'll want to know about Whitmore." His expression changed. Not dramatically, a slight tightening around the eyes, a settling of something. "Tell me," she told him. "Not all of it. Not the 8 months of history, but the important parts, the refused proposal, the store merger." His father wanted the 2 visits, the things Whitmore had said. She told it plainly, without editorializing the way she'd enter it in a ledger if she kept a ledger for such things. When she finished, he was quiet. "He told people," he said. It wasn't a question. "He told people enough," she said. Reese Callahan stood up. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the floor beside the chair. He turned it in his hands twice the way she'd noticed he did when he was thinking through something with his whole body, rather than just his head. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly." "I generally do." "Are you telling me all this because you want me to walk away?" The question landed with the precision of a thrown knife. She felt it go in and tried to decide what the honest answer was. "I'm telling you all this," she said slowly, "because you deserve to know the full landscape of what you're walking into. If you walk in at all. That is not the same thing as wanting me to leave." "No," she said, "it isn't." He put his hat on. "Then I'll see you Wednesday," he said. "Same time, same place." He was at the door before she spoke. "Reese." He turned. "Why?" she said. It came out more raw than she intended. Not the professional Margaret, not the careful Margaret, just the 24-year-old woman who had spent a decade being certain she wasn't worth the effort and was now looking directly at someone who appeared to disagree. "Why does it not? Why doesn't any of it change what I see?" he said. She nodded. He looked at her from the doorway for a moment. "Because what I see is a woman who has been carrying other people's weight for so long, she's forgotten it isn't hers to carry." He paused. "I'd like to see what you're like when you put some of it down." He went. She sat in the chair beside the stove in her empty store and pressed both hands to her face and breathed. Small and standing. She was starting to think that applied to her too. Wednesday came, and then the following Wednesday, and the one after that. He came for supper, and she went, and neither of them made a larger production of it than it was, which was the thing she was most grateful for. No declarations, no performance. Just two people sitting across a table eating food and talking the way people did when they wanted to spend time together, and were honest enough to admit it. She learned things about him in those weeks. She learned that he had grown up on a cattle operation in Montana that went under when he was 20, that he had spent his 20s doing work. Wherever it was, that he was methodical about horses in a way that bordered on devotion, that he read when he could get books and was embarrassed about how much he liked poetry, that he had a laugh he kept mostly contained, but which arrived unexpectedly and sounded like it belonged to someone younger. He learned things about her. That she had been running the store since she was 19 and her father's hands started going. That she kept 2 cats she pretended not to be attached to. That she had once thrown a jar of molasses at a man who grabbed her wrist across the counter and hit him squarely between the shoulder blades at a distance of 12 feet. That she was secretly proud of that shot and had never told anyone. 12 feet, he said. He had a head start by the time I threw it, she said. He laughed, the real one, the unexpected one, and she felt it in her chest like a struck bell. But Harrow was watching. Harrow was always watching. It came first through Mrs. Harkins, who made a point of stopping Margaret on the street one afternoon with the particular brightness of a woman delivering information she found distasteful but couldn't resist sharing. She had heard, she said, that people were concerned. That a respectable man, a working man, was being, she searched for the word, led along, by someone who could not give him what a man like that would naturally want. Margaret stopped walking. What did you say? Mrs. Harkins had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I'm only telling you what's being said, dear. Then don't, Margaret said, and walked on. It came next through Tom Calloway himself, who pulled Reese aside one morning in the yard and said something quiet that Margaret only learned about later, and which amounted to a man ought to think carefully before he ties himself to a woman the town has decided to treat a certain way, because that treatment doesn't stop, and it doesn't stay just around the woman. Reese, according to Tom's own account, when he told Margaret what had happened, sitting at her kitchen table one evening with his hat on his knee, telling her plainly, because that was how he did things, had said, Tom, I appreciate your concern, but I am 38 years old, and I have been deciding things for myself for a while now. Tom had said that was fair and gone back to the horses. You told me that because you thought I should know, Margaret said. I told you that because you should know. He turned the hat in his hands. There will be more of it, Margaret, from more directions. I want you to know that I know that, and I'm still here. It gets harder before it gets easier, she said. If it gets easier at all. I know. You say that very easily, because I mean it simply. He set the hat down on the table. Some things are simple. People make them complicated, but underneath the complication, they're simple. I know what I want. I know what kind of person you are. The arithmetic isn't hard. She looked at him across the kitchen table. Her father's kitchen, her father's table, the one she had sat at alone for 2 years and thought about arithmetic and what it meant for a thing to be simple. I have a bad habit, she said. Just one. Don't? She said, but she almost smiled. I have a habit of waiting for the part where it falls apart. I can't seem to stop doing it. I've noticed, he said. Does it bother you? It makes sense, he said. A person who's been left enough times learns to watch for the leaving. He held her gaze. I'm not leaving Margaret. You can't promise that. No, he agreed. I can't. I can only keep showing up until you believe it. She looked at him a long time. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. That might take a while, she said. I've got time, he said. The confrontation between Whitmore and Reese happened on a Tuesday, and Margaret heard about it from 3 different people before noon. The first account came from young Danny Prescott, who worked the livery and had a gift for detail. He told her Whitmore had stopped Reese on the street near the feed store in front of a small audience of men who had nothing better to do than stand around and watch. He called him out, Margaret said. Not exactly, Danny said, scratching the back of his neck. More like he said it quiet, but loud enough. The second account came from Lucy Garrett, who had been on the opposite side of the street and had excellent hearing. She said Whitmore had told Reese in front of 4 witnesses that he ought to know what he was getting into, that a woman who couldn't give a man a family was a woman who couldn't give a man anything worth having, that Reese would figure that out sooner or later, and it would save everyone trouble if he figured it out now. What did Mr. Callahan say? Margaret asked very carefully. Lucy paused. He said much obliged for the opinion, and then he walked away. The third account came from Tom Calloway himself, who stopped in the store that afternoon with a tin of nails he didn't need, which was his way of checking on things without making a production of it. Your man handled himself well this morning, Tom said. He's not my man, Margaret said automatically. Tom looked at her over the tin of nails. He had been running cattle for 30 years and had the face for it, lined and patient and not easily fooled. All right, he said. He handled himself well. What did he say? Exactly. Said what I told you. Then he walked away. Tom set the tin on the counter. A man who walks away from Gerald Whitmore in public where everyone can see him not flinching is saying something without saying anything. He pushed the tin toward her. Keep the change. He left. Margaret stood at the counter with Tom Calloway's unnecessary nails and thought about a man who walked away from a public insult without flinching, and what it meant to say something by saying nothing, and how she had spent 10 years trying to do the same thing. And it had never once looked as clean as that. The first real crisis came on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after their first supper, in the form of a letter delivered to the store that Margaret read behind the counter, and then read again because the first reading didn't quite resolve into sense. It was from the bank, specifically from the manager of the Teller County Savings Bank, a man named Higgins, who Margaret had dealt with for 2 years without incident. The letter informed her in the careful language of institutional regret that her account had been reviewed, and that due to concerns about the store's financial stability, her line of credit had been reduced by half, effective immediately. She folded the letter. She unfolded it and read it a third time. The store's financial stability. She had never once been late on a payment. She had never missed an obligation. The store's books were cleaner than the bank's lobby, and she knew it, and Higgins knew it, and anyone who examined the ledgers for 30 seconds knew it. This was not about financial stability. She was not stupid. Whitmore's father owned a significant share of that bank. She put the letter in the drawer under the counter and served the next 4 customers with the same competence and warmth she brought to everything. And when the store was empty for a moment, she went to the back room and stood between the shelves and breathed and thought with a precision that felt like cold water. She could absorb the reduction if she was careful. It would be tight, genuinely tight. There were 2 families she was carrying on credit, the Kowalskis and the Brennans, and if she had to call those in, it would hurt people who had done nothing wrong. But she could manage. She had managed worse, but this was a signal. Whitmore's father was telling her something, and the something was cooperate. Sell the store, or sell the land, or stop refusing to be what the Whitmores wanted her to be, and the pressure would ease. She went back out to the counter. She helped a woman choose between 2 bolts of wool. She sold a pound of coffee, and a box of buckles, and 3 cans of peaches. She did not mention the letter to anyone that day. She mentioned it to Reese that evening when he came by after his work at Calloway's, standing in the narrow hallway of her house with his hat in his hands, because she hadn't yet invited him all the way in, and she handed him the letter and watched him read it. His face went very still in the way faces went still when a person was keeping something controlled. "You understand what this is," he said. "I understand what it is. What are you going to do?" She had been thinking about that all day, and what she had arrived at was not dramatic. It was practical, as things with her tended to be. "I'm going to go see Higgins tomorrow morning," she said. "I'm going to bring the ledgers. I'm going to ask him to show me on paper why the bank considers the store a financial risk. And I'm going to ask him to put any concerns in writing specifically so that we have a record." Reese was quiet. "That's not a confrontation," she said. "That's documentation." "You think he'll back down?" "I think he'll be uncomfortable," she said. "Men who do things like this are not comfortable when they have to account for them clearly." She took the letter back. "I also think I should find out who else in this town has a loan or a line of credit. They'd prefer not to have called in suddenly, and make sure they understand that what happens to my store could happen to theirs." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this all day." "Since 10 this morning." He almost said something, caught it, said something else. "Do you need help?" "Not yet," she said. "When I do, I'll tell you." "All right." He turned the hat in his hands. "Margaret." "Yes." "I know you can handle this alone. I've watched you handle things alone for weeks." He held her gaze. "You don't have to." She looked at him in the hallway of her father's house, with the letter from the bank in her hand, and the evening going dark through the window behind him. And she thought about what it meant for that sentence to be true. She had been handling things alone for so long that she had forgotten what the alternative felt like. Not helplessness, that was not what he was offering. Something else. Something she did not have precise language for because she had not had occasion to use it. Company. That was the word. He was offering her company. "I know," she said quietly. He nodded once, put his hat on, stepped back toward the door. "Reese," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. Just that. Just the plain word, the way she'd said it the first time, without the professional warmth, without the careful distance. Just herself saying it to him. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "Good night, Margaret," he said. She closed the door after him and stood in the hallway and pressed her back against the wood. Outside, she heard his boots on the porch steps. She heard them slow for just a moment, at the bottom one beat two, and then continue down the path to the gate, and then the gate close. She stood there for another minute. She was not used to this. Not used to someone standing still long enough for her to believe in them. She thought about what he had said. "You don't have to." She went to the kitchen and got out the ledgers and spread them across the table and began to build her case for the morning meeting with Higgins, because building cases was what she knew how to do, and because motion was the thing that kept her sane, and because somewhere underneath the motion and the ledgers and the careful competence was a woman who was starting slowly, carefully, with great attention to the possibility of being wrong, to believe that maybe he meant what he said. Maybe he was not going anywhere. Maybe small and standing was enough. She worked until midnight. She went to bed with ink on her fingers and the ledgers stacked by the door, and the first real possibility of hope she had allowed herself in a very long time, sitting quietly in her chest, fragile and specific, and hers. She was afraid of it. She let herself be afraid of it anyway. That she thought turning out the lamp was probably what courage actually looked like from the inside. Higgins blinked at her 3 times across the desk before he spoke. She had arrived at the bank at 8 in the morning, 10 minutes before it opened, and she had waited on the step with the ledgers under her arm and her spine straight, and her face arranged in the expression she used when she needed to project more certainty than she felt. When Higgins unlocked the door and found her standing there, he had the specific look of a man who had hoped this particular problem would solve itself before it reached him. It had not solved itself. "Miss Hale," he said. "Mrs.," she said. "Good morning, Mr. Higgins. I'd appreciate a few minutes of your time." She sat down across from his desk and opened the ledgers and walked him through 2 years of clean accounts without raising her voice or making a single accusation. She asked him to show her in writing what specific metric of financial instability had prompted the review. She asked him to point to the line, the month, the number that had concerned the bank. He could not. He tried twice, citing general economic conditions and broader portfolio assessments, and each time she asked him which specific number, and each time there was no specific number, because there was no real answer, because the real answer was not in any ledger. "Mr. Higgins," she said when the second attempt petered out. "I have been a customer of this bank for 2 years. In that time, I have been early on every payment and have never once requested an extension. My books are here." She set her hand flat on the ledgers. "If there is a legitimate concern, I would like it documented. If there is not—" She let the sentence sit there. Higgins looked at the ledgers. He looked at his hands. He was not a bad man, she thought. He was a man who had made a choice that was easier than courage and was now sitting across from the consequence of that choice. "I'll review the decision," he said. "I'd appreciate that," she said. "In writing, please, within the week." She picked up her ledgers and left. She stood outside the bank in the sharp morning air and breathed once deeply, and then walked to the store and opened up and made coffee and did not tell herself it was a victory because it was not a victory yet. It was a first move, and first moves meant nothing until the second move confirmed them. She told Reese about it that evening. "He folded," Reese said. "He didn't fold. He retreated. There's a difference." She set down her coffee cup. "He'll go back to Whitmore's father and explain that pushing directly on the bank account is too visible. They'll try something else." "What's something else?" "I don't know yet." She looked at her hands. "But I have a list of 12 businesses in Harrow with loans or accounts at that bank, and I've sent word to 8 of them asking if they'd be willing to meet." Quietly. He was quiet for a moment. "You built a coalition." "I built a conversation," she said. "It might become a coalition." He looked at her across the table, with an expression she had started to recognize. Not admiration exactly, because admiration had a direction to it. A distance, something more like recognition. Like he was looking at something he already knew and was glad to see again. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He picked up his coffee. "I'm just watching you work." She looked away, because she didn't know what to do with the way he said that. The letter from Whitmore Sr. arrived on a Monday, not to the store, to her house. Which was worse, it meant he knew where she lived in the way that people knew things they weren't supposed to know, the way that was meant to feel like a hand on the back of the neck. The letter was brief and written in the language of a man accustomed to being understood without being explicit. He wished her well. He hoped the store was managing. He wanted her to know that his son's proposal had been made in good faith, and that doors could remain open if she chose to keep them open. She read it twice. She put it in the drawer with the bank letter. She knew what it meant. It meant the bank pressure had rattled someone. It meant the coalition had gotten noticed. It meant she had moved something even slightly, and the Whitmores were recalibrating. She brought both letters to Reese that evening. He read them without speaking. Then he set them on the table and looked at her. "He's offering you a way out," Reese said. "He's offering me a leash with a longer chain," she said. "It's not the same thing." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to meet with those 7 business owners on Thursday. And then I'm going to write a letter to the county land office requesting the documentation on the railroad right-of-way survey. Because if that railroad route is real, and if it runs where I think it runs, the land they want isn't just my store's land." She met his eyes. "It's half of Main Street." Reese went still. "Nobody knows," she said. "Or nobody said it out loud. I found one line in a survey report from 2 years ago that I wasn't supposed to have. It was misfiled. I found it in a stack of documents Higgins gave me when I opened the account. I didn't know what I was looking at then. I know now." He looked at her for a long moment. "Margaret, if you're right, if I'm right, Gerald Whitmore's father isn't just pressuring a woman into selling a dry goods store. He's consolidating land ownership ahead of a railroad deal that would affect every property owner on this street, and he's doing it quietly one at a time before anyone realizes they should be comparing notes." The silence that followed was the kind that happened when a thing shifted in size. "You need to be careful," he said, and his voice was different, lower, more deliberate. "If he finds out, you know—" "I know." She picked up the letters and folded them. "That's why I'm moving quickly and quietly, and why I haven't told anyone except you." "Why tell me?" She looked at him directly. "Because if something goes wrong, someone needs to know what I know." He held her gaze. Something moved through his face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger, but was the complicated thing that lived between them. "Nothing is going to go wrong," he said. "You don't know that." "No." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers the first time he had touched her with that kind of deliberateness. Not a handshake, not an accidental brush, but a hand placed with intention. "But I'm going to be here either way." She looked at his hand on hers. She did not pull away. "All right," she said quietly. Thursday's meeting happened in the back room of the hardware store, which belonged to Carl Brower, a man whose temper had been building since he got his own letter of review from Teller County Savings 3 weeks prior, and hadn't connected it to anything until Margaret's word arrived. 7 people came: a miller, 2 farmers with mortgages, the woman who ran the boarding house, Ada, 61 years old, 20 years of work built into those walls, Carl himself, a feed merchant named Jensen, and Lucy Garrett, who had no loan but showed up anyway and sat in the corner with her arms crossed and her eyes moving between faces with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. Margaret spread the survey document on the table without preamble. "The railroad right-of-way," she said. "The survey was filed 18 months ago. The route runs along the south edge of town and turns north at the creek. Every property on that turn is in the acquisition zone." She let them look at it. "If Ezra Whitmore has been quietly buying and consolidating those properties before the route is announced publicly, he'll own the corridor before anyone in this room has a chance to negotiate." The room was quiet for a moment. Carl Brower said, "How did you get this?" "It was misfiled," she said. "I found it by accident. I've had it reviewed by a land attorney in Casper." She let that sit. "The route is real." Jensen leaned over the map. "My east pasture is in this zone." "Yes," Margaret said. "And the mill," the miller said. "And the boarding house," Ada said. Her voice was flat. She had come in with the expression of a woman who expected bad news and had made her peace with it. Now she was looking at the survey with something sharper. "He sent me a letter last month. Said he might be interested in purchasing if I ever considered selling." "He sent me one too," Jensen said. "And me," Carl said. Margaret waited. One by one, 4 of the 7 people at the table mentioned letters. Quiet, friendly letters. Expressions of interest from a man who had all the time in the world. Lucy Garrett said from her corner, "He's been working this for at least a year." "At least," Margaret said. Carl put both hands flat on the table. "What do? We file a joint public records request," Margaret said. "All of us together, for the full railroad survey and the acquisition schedule. Once it's a joint request from 7 property owners, it can't be quietly buried. And once the route is public knowledge, Whitmore loses the advantage of timing." She looked around the room. "It doesn't stop him from buying land, but it means everyone negotiates from information instead of ignorance." Ada said, "And your store? You're in this zone too?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Is that why you started looking into it?" "I started looking because he pressured my bank. I kept looking because the math didn't add up for just one store." She met Ada's eyes. "By the time I found the survey, it wasn't about my store anymore." Ada nodded slowly, the kind of nod that was also a decision. "I'm in," Ada said. 6 of the 7 signed the request that evening. Margaret did not pressure the 7th, a cautious farmer named Hartley, because she understood caution and because 6 was enough. She walked home with Reese beside her, and they walked without talking for half a block before he said, "How did it go?" 6 of 7, she said. "That's enough. That's what I thought. Whitmore's going to find out, probably by the end of the week." She kept walking. "I need it filed before that happens." "I know someone who rides to Casper on Wednesday," he said. "Could have it filed by Thursday afternoon." She looked at him sideways. "You've been thinking about the logistics." "I've been thinking about a lot of things," he said, and she accepted that the way she accepted everything from him carefully with both hands, afraid of what she'd do if she dropped it. Whitmore found out on Friday. She knew because he came to the store in the middle of the morning with his father, and Ezra Whitmore Sr. was a different creature entirely from his son. Gerald was bluster and wounded pride. Ezra was cold arithmetic. He was 62 and had the stillness of a man who had been getting what he wanted for a very long time. He stood at the counter and looked at Margaret the way you looked at a calculation that had come out differently than expected. "Miss Hale," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." She looked at both of them. "What can I do for you?" "I think you know," Ezra said. "I'd prefer specifics," she said. Gerald shifted beside his father, but Ezra put one hand out slightly barely visible, and Gerald went still. "You filed a public records request," Ezra said, "with 6 other property owners." "7 originally," she said. 6 signatures. A joint request. He tilted his head, assessing. "That was clever. It's a legal process," she said, "available to any property owner." "It will cause unnecessary alarm," he said. "People will draw conclusions that aren't warranted." "Or they'll draw conclusions that are," she said. His eyes stayed level. "I've been doing business in Teller County for 30 years, Miss Hale. I know every judge, every land agent, every clerk who processes these filings. A records request is not the same as an outcome." "No," she agreed. "It isn't, but it's a conversation starter. And conversations once started are difficult to stop." Silence. Gerald said, "This is because I withdrew the proposal. This is personal." "Gerald," his father said, and Gerald stopped. Ezra looked at Margaret for a long moment. She held his gaze. Her hands were flat on the counter, and she was keeping them still by an act of will, because what she felt underneath the stillness was not confidence. It was the feeling of having stepped off a ledge and found the ground farther down than expected, but still falling in a straight line. "What do you want, Miss Hale?" Ezra said. "Specifically." "I want the railroad route made public before any more acquisition letters go out. I want every property owner on that corridor to know what their land is worth before they decide whether to sell. That's all." "That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It isn't." He picked up his hat from the counter, turned it once. "You've made your position clear," he said. "I have," she said. He left. Gerald followed without looking at her, and that absence told her more than the looking ever had. The store was empty. Margaret let out a breath that had been waiting for several minutes. She thought about what Ezra had said. He knew every judge and land agent and clerk. That was true. The records request could be delayed, lost, processed slowly by someone whose livelihood benefited from the delay. She had known that when she filed it. She had filed it anyway because visibility was the only weapon she had, and because 7 names on a document were harder to dismiss than 1. But she had underestimated something. She saw it now, too late, standing alone in her store. She had underestimated how fast Ezra Whitmore moved when he felt the ground shift. Yamha. The next 3 days were quiet in the way that precedes something loud. Reese listened that evening. He did not tell her she was wrong to have done it, and he did not tell her everything would be fine, and she was grateful for both omissions, because they were the 2 easiest and most useless things he could have said. "He'll come at you from a direction you're not expecting," Reese said. "I know. Think about what that looks like." "I have been." She looked at the table. The store's mortgage is held by Teller County Savings. If Whitmore calls it in early through a third-party appraisal, undervalue the property, Reese said, following her logic. Loan becomes technically underwater. Review triggered. Weeks of legal response time, probably. She pressed her fingers to her forehead. "There's a lawyer in Casper who helped me read the survey. Land law. He's not free." "How much do you have in savings?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Is it enough?" she said. "For the lawyer, probably. For a fight that goes long." He stopped. "Margaret, I have money set aside, several years of steady wages and very little to spend them on." She looked at him. "Reese, I'm not offering charity," he said, and his voice was steady. I'm offering the same thing I've been offering since I fixed that fence. I've got something that's useful. You need it. I have it." He held her gaze. The arithmetic isn't complicated. She thought about what she was being offered. Not just the money. The money was the surface. What was underneath was the thing she had spent 24 years struggling to receive without immediately returning it. Another person standing beside her, not because they owed her, not because they pitied her, but because they had chosen to be there. "I'll pay you back," she said. "Margaret." With interest, written down. Something moved in his face. Not exasperation, softer than that. Fond. "All right," he said. "Written down." No. The thing she hadn't anticipated came on a Tuesday evening 8 days after Ezra's visit. It didn't come from the bank. It didn't come from a lawyer or a land agent or any legal mechanism at all. It came in the form of a fire. Not her store. The store was still standing when she ran down Main Street toward the orange light in the sky, her shawl half on and her boots unlaced, having heard the bell from 4 blocks away. The fire was at Ada's boarding house. Started in the kitchen, they said later. A lamp left too close to a curtain. These things happened. Margaret stood in the street with the rest of Harrow, watching Ada's boarding house burn. She watched the volunteer bucket line work. She watched Reese in the line. He had been closer, and arrived before her passing buckets with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had done this before. She watched Ada standing 15 feet away, with her arms wrapped around herself and her face white, watching 20 years of work collapse into embers. They saved the shell. The interior was gutted. When the fire was controlled and the bucket line dissolved and people began drifting home in the gray early morning, Ada sat down in the street because there was nowhere else to sit. Margaret sat down beside her. Not on the step. In the street. They sat without talking for a while. "It started in the kitchen," Ada said finally. "That's what they're saying." Ada looked at what was left of the building. "I never leave a lamp near a curtain. I was in the front room. I smelled it before I saw it. I checked the kitchen every night before bed." Her voice was flat and exhausted and certain. "I checked it last night." Margaret did not say anything. "I can't prove it," Ada said. "I know I can't. But I know what I know." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She thought about Ezra Whitmore's voice in her store. A records request is not the same as an outcome. A fire left nothing. Nothing except a woman sitting in a street at 4 in the morning with 20 years of work behind her and her name on a public records request. "Ada," Margaret said, "where are you going to stay?" "I don't know yet." "You'll stay with me," Margaret said, "until you figure out what comes next." Ada looked at her. Something in her face broke briefly and then held. "That's generous." "It's a spare room," Margaret said. "It isn't generous." Ada nodded. Reese appeared out of the dark and sat down on the other side of Ada without a word. He smelled of smoke and water and effort. He sat with the same quality he brought to everything present, unhurried, not filling the space with noise. The 3 of them sat in the street. After a while, Ada said, "What do we do?" Margaret was looking at the ruined boarding house. She was thinking about Ezra Whitmore's stillness, his 62 years of getting what he wanted, the way he had picked up his hat with the practiced calm of a man who had already decided what the next move would be. She thought about the fact that the records request had been filed and could not be unfiled. 6 names on it. A fire destroyed property, but it did not destroy paper. It did not destroy what had already been sent and stamped in a county office 2 days right away. "We do what we were already doing," she said. "Only faster." Reese looked at her sideways. She could see in his expression that he understood what she meant, that he was with her, and that he knew this was not going to be simple. She knew it wasn't going to be simple. She had stopped expecting simple a long time ago. The morning after the fire, Harrow woke up with ash in the air and a story to tell itself. Margaret heard 3 versions before she'd been open an hour. The first came from a farmer who bought flour and said it was a tragedy terrible. These old buildings went up so fast. The second came from a woman who bought thread and said Ada had always kept a careless kitchen. It was a wonder it hadn't happened sooner. The third came from Danny Prescott, who came in for nothing in particular and stood at the counter and said quietly that 2 of Whitmore's men had been seen on that block 3 nights running. Margaret looked at him. "I'm not saying anything," Danny said. "I'm just saying what I saw." "Who else saw them?" "Couple of people." He turned his hat in his hands. "Nobody who'd say it in public." She thanked him. He left. She stood at the counter for a moment and thought about what could be proven and what couldn't, and about the gap between those 2 things, which was where men like Ezra Whitmore had always lived. She wrote to the lawyer in Casper that afternoon. She told him about the fire, told him what Ada had said, told him they needed to move faster on the records request, and that she wanted to understand what legal options existed if property destruction could be connected to a party with financial motive. She did not use the word arson in the letter. She did not need to. She handed the letter to Reese that evening. He read it before he folded it. He always read what she gave him, not because he was prying she had learned, but because he wanted to understand what he was carrying. "You're building a case," he said. "I'm building a record," she said, "in case I ever need a case." "You think he'll go further?" "I think a man who has spent a year acquiring land quietly will not stop because one woman filed a document." She met his eyes. "I think Ada's boarding house was a message, and I think the message will get louder if I go quiet." He folded the letter. He held it for a moment. "Margaret," he said. "I know," she said. "You don't know what I was going to say." "You were going to say be careful." He looked at her. "I was going to say I'm proud of you." She stopped. He set the letter in his coat pocket. "I know you don't need me to say it. I know you're not doing any of this for anyone's approval, including mine. But I'm saying it anyway." He looked at her steadily. "You walked into a bank with your ledgers and made a man reverse a decision made under pressure from someone much more powerful than either of you. You organized 6 frightened people into a legal action. You're running a store and housing a woman who lost everything and building a case in your spare time." His voice was even. "I'm proud of you, that's all." Margaret stood very still. She had been praised before. Customers said the store was well run. Mrs. Pendleton said she was a good person. She had received all of those things and filed them away and kept moving. This was different. This was a man who had watched her. Not watched the performance, watched her. Watched her be scared and be practical and be exhausted and keep going anyway, and was saying that what he saw when he watched all of that was something worth being proud of. "Thank you," she said. Just that, just the plain word. He nodded once and picked up his hat. "I'll get this to Casper," he said. He was at the door. "Reese," she said. He turned. She looked at him across the store in the late afternoon light and thought about a fence that had been down for 6 weeks that someone fixed because it needed fixing. She thought about a man who had stood outside her meeting because his presence inside would change the dynamic, and who understood that without being told. "Come to supper tonight," she said. "Not the hotel, my house. Ada will be there." Something crossed his face. Not surprise. Something quieter, like a door opening in a room he had been waiting outside of for a while. "I'll be there," he said. He left. She stood at the counter for a long moment. Outside, Harrow went about its business. The ordinary machinery of a town that did not know yet what was coming, that was still sorting out its story about a fire in a lamp near a curtain. Margaret began counting the hours until she could close. It was the first time in 2 years she had been genuinely impatient for the day to end, so that something better could begin. She was still afraid. She was still carrying the weight of the bank letter and Ada's white face in the street, and Ezra Whitmore's voice saying, "A records request is not the same as an outcome." She was still 24 years old and a woman who had spent a decade being certain she was not worth the effort. But she was also, for the first time in a long time, someone who was not carrying all of it alone. And that, small and standing as it was turning out to be its own kind of everything. The lawyer's name was Everett Cross, and he arrived in Harrow on a Thursday morning without announcement, which Margaret had asked him to do, and which he had respected without asking why. She had expected someone older. Cross was 35, thin-faced with ink-stained fingers and the unhurried manner of a man who had learned early that urgency and speed were different things. He came into the store, introduced himself quietly, and sat down across from her at the small table in the back room, with his briefcase on his knee and his hat on the floor, and the focused attention of someone who had ridden 2 days and intended to use the time well. "I've read everything you sent," he said. "The survey document, the bank letter, the reversal, the records request filing. You've been careful." "I've been trying to be," she said. "The fire." He paused. "I need you to tell me exactly what Ada told you." Her exact words in order. She told him. He wrote it down without commentary. When she finished, he set down the pen and looked at what he'd written for a moment. "This is not enough for a criminal charge," he said. "Not as it stands. Witnesses who won't come forward publicly, no physical evidence connecting anyone to the point of origin. What you have is a strong moral case and a weak legal one." "I know," she said, "but the records request changes things. Once that goes public, and it will go public, the county has 30 days to respond, and the clock is running. Every property owner on that corridor has standing to challenge any acquisition made without full disclosure of the survey." He tapped his pen on the paper. "Whitmore's been buying quietly because the value of the land changes dramatically once the railroad route is known. Any sale made before that disclosure could be contested on grounds of material misrepresentation." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "How many properties has he acquired?" "That's what I've been trying to determine." Cross opened his briefcase and pulled out a folded set of documents. "I pulled the public land transfer records for Teller County going back 2 years. 6 properties on or adjacent to the right-of-way corridor have transferred to a holding company called Meridian Land Partners." He set the documents on the table. "Meridian is registered in Cheyenne. The listed principals are 3 names I didn't recognize. But the registered agent," he pointed to a line, "is the law firm that handles all of Ezra Whitmore's commercial transactions." Margaret looked at the line. She looked at it for a long moment. "He hid behind a company," she said. "He was careful," Cross said. "But not careful enough. The agent connection is documentable. And if we can show that Meridian was operating with advanced knowledge of the right-of-way, which the survey document you found suggests..." He sat back. "Then we have the basis for a fraud complaint. Not a guarantee, but a basis. What do we need?" "We need the 6 people who signed that records request to hold together," he said. "We need Ada to put what she told you in a written affidavit, even if she says she can't prove it. The affidavit creates a record of her account and a timeline. And we need to get the fraud complaint filed before Whitmore finds out what we know about Meridian." "How long do we have?" "Days," he said. "Maybe less. The county clerk who received your records request has to notify all interested parties. That's standard procedure. Whitmore will be notified by end of the week." She looked at the Meridian documents. 6 properties. And hers would have been the 7th if she had sold. And Ada's the 8th if Ada had sold instead of signed and then found her boarding house in flames. "Mr. Cross," she said. "Everett," he said. "Everett." She met his eyes. "What are the chances this works?" He was quiet for a moment. She appreciated that he didn't answer immediately. It meant the answer was honest. "If everything holds," he said. "If your 6 signatories don't get frightened off. If the affidavit is signed. If the county land office processes the records request without interference. If Whitmore doesn't find a way to discredit the survey document or your possession of it." He paused. "Maybe 60%. 60, she said. "That's not bad odds," he said, "for fighting a man who has owned this county for 30 years. She looked at the table. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." She told Reese that evening. He listened through the whole of it without interrupting, which she had come to understand was not passivity. It was how he processed things completely before he responded. 60%, he said when she was done. That's what he said. And the 40%. Whitmore has time, money, and relationships we don't have. She was matter-of-fact about it. He could pressure 2 of the 6 signatories into withdrawing. He could challenge the admissibility of the survey document. He could find a judge who's friendly to him. She paused. Or he could do something else we don't anticipate, the way Ada's fire was something we didn't anticipate. Reese was quiet for a moment. "You're not frightened," he said. "I'm terrified," she said. "But frightened and stopped are different things." He looked at her across the table. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to talk to Carl Brower," she said. "He trusts you more than he trusts me right now. I think Whitmore's men have been in his ear this week. I can tell by the way he wouldn't meet my eyes at the hardware store yesterday. I'm not asking you to pressure him. I'm asking you to have a straight conversation and see where he stands. I can do that. And I need you to stay close to Ada," she said. "She's holding, but barely. She woke up twice last night. She needs someone nearby who isn't me, because I'm the one who pulled her into this." "You didn't pull her," he said. "She signed." "She signed because I asked." "Margaret." His voice was even. "Ada Whitfield has been running that boarding house for 20 years. She signed because she's a grown woman who looked at a survey map and made a decision about her own property. You don't get to take credit for her choices just because you're afraid of the outcome." She opened her mouth, closed it. "That's the same habit," he said. "Different direction." She knew what he meant. The habit of carrying weight that wasn't hers. She applied it to blame as readily as she applied it to responsibility. She had never thought about that before. She thought about it now. "All right," she said after a moment. "I'll talk to Carl," he said. "And I'll check on Ada." "Thank you." He nodded. He stood to go. "Reese?" He stopped. "The 40%, she said. "If this doesn't work, if Whitmore wins this, I want you to know that I don't regret it. Any of it." She held his gaze. "The records request the coalition, the lawyer. Even if it costs me the store, I'd do it the same way." He looked at her for a moment. "I know you would," he said. "That's one of the things I—" He stopped. Something moved in his face, and he let it settle without finishing the sentence. "I'll talk to Carl first thing tomorrow." He left. She sat at the table and thought about the unfinished sentence and what might have been at the end of it, and told herself not to build too much from an incomplete thought, and then sat there and built from it anyway, because she was only human. Carl held. Reese spent an hour with him Tuesday morning, and whatever passed between them, Reese reported it in brief. Carl had been approached, offered a quiet resolution of his bank review in exchange for withdrawing from the records request, had told Whitmore's intermediary he'd think about it, and had been thinking about it in the direction Whitmore wanted until Reese showed up, and they had a straight conversation about what withdrawal would actually mean. Carl held. He called Margaret that afternoon to tell her himself. "I'm in," he said. "All the way." "Carl, don't thank me," he said. "I almost didn't. That's not something I'm proud of. I'm telling you so you know it was real, and I decided anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "That means something," she said. "That you decided anyway." She heard him breathe. "You going to win this thing?" "I'm going to try," she said. "Close enough," he said, and hung up. The affidavit from Ada took 2 hours. Cross sat at Margaret's kitchen table with Ada across from him and asked his questions carefully, not leading, not pushing, just opening doors and letting Ada walk through them at her own pace. Margaret sat nearby with coffee. She wasn't drinking, and watched Ada do the thing she had been watching everyone in this story have to do sooner or later: decide between the safety of silence and the cost of speaking. Ada chose to speak. She described the kitchen, the checked lamp, the position of the curtain, the smell that came before the sound. She described the 2 nights previous when she had noticed the same man sitting on the bench across the street, not doing anything, just sitting. She described telling herself it was nothing. When she finished, Cross read it back to her. She made 2 corrections, the exact timing of when she'd smelled the smoke, the color of the man's coat rather than his hat, and then she signed it. She pressed her hand flat on the paper, after she signed the way you pressed your hand on something you wanted to hold down. "Is that enough?" she asked Cross. "It creates a record," he said. "Whether it's enough depends on things we don't control yet." Ada nodded. She picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands and looked at the wall. 23 years, she said to nobody in particular. "I built that place board by board. My husband helped me with the framing before he passed. We put the floors in ourselves." She paused. "I am not going to let a man who burns down buildings in the dark get those boards for half price and call it business." The kitchen was quiet. "No," Margaret said. "You're not." Cross filed the fraud complaint from the county seat the following morning. He rode out before dawn so no one in Harrow would see him leave. The complaint hit Ezra Whitmore's desk on a Friday afternoon. Margaret didn't know this at the time. What she knew on Friday afternoon was that Gerald Whitmore came into her store for the first time in 3 weeks, and he came alone, and he set his hat on the counter and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, not the performance of superiority, something almost like acknowledgement. "You filed a fraud complaint," he said. "My lawyer filed a fraud complaint," she said. "Against my father. Against Meridian Land Partners and its principals," she said. "Which your father's legal representatives have a documented relationship with." Gerald was quiet. He drummed his fingers once on the counter and stopped himself, a level of self-control she had not previously witnessed from him. "My father wants to settle," he said. Margaret went very still. "He wants to settle," Gerald said again. "Before this goes further, he wants to make an offer to the property owners involved, fair market value for voluntary sales, a formal disclosure of the railroad survey to all affected landowners, and a release of the fraud complaint." She looked at him. She had expected more time, more pressure, another escalation, another thing she hadn't anticipated. She had not expected a settlement offer on a Friday afternoon from Gerald Whitmore alone, hat on the counter. "Why are you the one bringing this?" she said. Something crossed his face. Not guilt exactly. Gerald Whitmore wasn't built for guilt in the traditional sense. But something adjacent. The first draft of it. "Because my father doesn't make offers," he said. "He sends lawyers. If he's sending me—" He stopped. "It means he wants this done quickly and quietly, and he needs you to believe it's sincere." "Is it?" she said. "Sincere." "The terms are real," he said. "Whether the sincerity is—" He picked up his hat. "I'm 30 years old, Margaret. I have watched my father do business my entire life. I have watched him decide that some people don't count for enough to be worth the courtesy of honesty." He held the hat at his side. "You counted him wrong." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means you were right. About the survey. About Meridian. About all of it." He met her eyes, and there was something in it that cost him something. She could see the price of it. "And it means that when a woman with a dry goods store and no money and no political connections manages to build a fraud case against Ezra Whitmore in 6 weeks, he starts paying attention to her in a way he should have from the start." The store was very quiet. "I need to talk to the other property owners," she said. "I know. And to my lawyer." "I know. This conversation isn't an agreement." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for one." He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Margaret, the proposal, 8 months ago. I didn't withdraw it. I said I did because my pride was hurt, and because it was easier than admitting you were too good to say yes to someone like me." He looked at her. "That's not an apology. It's just the true thing." He left. Margaret stood at the counter for a very long time. She thought about what it meant for a man to say the true thing, when the true thing cost him something, and whether that meant he was capable of change, and concluded that it mattered for him, and not particularly for her, and that was all right. She had more important things to think about. The meeting with Cross and the 6 property owners happened Sunday evening in Carl's hardware store. Same back room, same lamp, but different air. The air of people who had been frightened and had held, and were now sitting in the aftermath of that which had its own particular quality. Cross laid out the settlement terms. Fair market value for voluntary sales based on post-survey land prices, in most cases 40 to 60% higher than what Whitmore had been quietly offering. Formal public disclosure of the railroad right-of-way survey within 30 days. Release of the fraud complaint upon compliance. A written acknowledgement of the Meridian Connection and its principles. The written acknowledgement is the important piece, Cross said. It creates a permanent record. Even if you release the complaint, the acknowledgement means it can be reopened if he tries this again. And Ada, Margaret said. Cross looked at her. Ada's situation is separate. There is no settlement provision for the boarding house. Ada said from her chair. I'm not selling. Everyone looked at her. My property is in the corridor, she said. And I'm not selling. I want to rebuild. She looked at Cross. Can I keep my signature on the records request and still not sell? Absolutely, Cross said. The request and any sale are entirely independent. Then that's what I want. She folded her hands in her lap. I want to rebuild, and I want the acknowledgement, and I want Whitmore to know that the building he burned down is going back up. The room was quiet. Then Carl said, I'm not selling either. Jensen said, same. The farmer named Hartley, who had not signed the original request, but had come tonight because Carl went personally to his farm, said, I'll take the fair price. My family needs it. He looked at the table. But I want the acknowledgement, in writing. That's on the table regardless, Cross said. Hartley nodded. Margaret looked around the room at 7 people who had been frightened and had in their different ways decided to stop arranging their lives around that fear. Do we accept? She said. 6 people looked at her. She looked at Cross. If we accept the terms as stated, what's our risk? Compliance risk, he said. Whitmore delivers on the terms. The fraud complaint is released. You each have the written acknowledgement as recourse if he doesn't comply. He paused. The alternative is, we go forward with the complaint. Months of proceedings costs for everyone in this room, uncertain outcome, Whitmore's full legal resources against us. 60%, Margaret said. Approximately. With the acknowledgement offer on the table if we walk away from it, I'd revise that down slightly. He'd be motivated. What do you recommend? Accept. Get the acknowledgement in writing, get the disclosure filed, and watch. She looked around the room. All right, she said. The settlement was signed 2 weeks later in the county land office, with Cross present and a county official as witness. Ezra Whitmore did not attend. He sent his lawyers. The papers were signed, exchanged, filed. The railroad survey disclosure was published in the county record 3 days later. Margaret read it on a Thursday morning, with her coffee standing at the counter of her store. The thing she felt was not triumph. She had thought it would feel like triumph. It felt quieter than that, the particular quiet of a thing that had been held under pressure for a long time, finally being released. The pressure didn't vanish. But it was different now, lighter, organized differently in her body. Reese came in that afternoon. I heard, he said. Word travels. Tom saw the filing. He came to the counter. How do you feel? She considered the question. Like I need to do inventory, she said. He looked at her. I'll feel it later, she said. Right now I have 4 weeks of neglected bookkeeping and a shelf of dry goods that reorganized itself while I wasn't looking. She met his eyes. Ask me again in a week. He almost smiled. All right. She looked at him across the counter. Reese, thank you. You did this, he said. We did this, she said. Don't do the thing where you make it smaller than it is. He looked at her steadily. I wasn't going to. She held his gaze. There was something between them in that moment that had been building since a fence on the creek side, and a tin of coffee, and a dinner that ended with her walking home alone, because she wasn't ready. Something that was now in the quiet afternoon of a solved thing very close to the surface. "Ask me to supper," she said. He blinked. "What?" "Ask me to supper," she said again. "Not the hotel, my house. Just ask me." He looked at her for a moment, reading whatever was in her face, and then something settled in his expression, something that had been waiting its turn. "Margaret," he said, "will you have supper with me tonight?" "Yes," she said. "I will." She went back to the inventory. He stayed at the counter a moment longer than he needed to, and she was aware of that, the way you were aware of sunlight through a window, not looking directly at it, but certain of the warmth. Then he tipped his hat and left. She counted bolts of fabric with a focus that did not entirely account for why she lost count twice. Supper that evening was the best meal she had made in months, which had nothing to do with the food. The food was ordinary beans and cornbread, and the last of the summer tomatoes and everything, to do with the fact that Ada had discreetly taken herself to Lucy Garrett's leaving the house quiet, and Reese sat across from Margaret at her father's table, and they ate together and talked and didn't talk, and it was the kind of quiet that was full rather than empty. After supper, she made a coffee and they sat with it and didn't go anywhere. At some point he said, "I have to tell you something." "All right," she said. "Tom's putting the ranch up for sale," he said. "End of the season. His wife wants to go east, her sister's in Ohio. When the season ends, the work at Callaway's ends with it." She looked at him. "I'm not saying that to make you worry," he said. "I'm saying it because I don't want to have information that affects you and not tell you." "What are you going to do?" she said. He set down the cup. He looked at her directly. "That depends," he said, "on what you want." She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. She had been waiting for the leaving. She had been waiting for it since the first supper, since the molasses jar story, since the hand on hers across the table, since every good thing that had accumulated until the weight of it was more than she knew how to carry. She had been waiting for the moment when the leaving revealed itself. This was not the leaving. She understood that now, sitting in her father's kitchen with the coffee going cold and a man who had told her what he knew because she deserved to know it. "Stay," she said. He was still. "There's work here," she said, and her voice was steady, and also not entirely steady, which was as honest as she could manage. "Carl needs a man who can manage his loading operation. Tom will have horses to move when the sale goes through. And the store—" She paused. "The store is going to be busier once the railroad corridor is public knowledge. I could use help that isn't a cat who knocks things off shelves." He was looking at her. "I'm telling you there's work," she said. "I'm not telling you to stay for work." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm telling you to stay because She stopped. "Because the time passes fast when you're here. The time passes very fast, and I always want it to last longer." She gave him back his own words. He recognized them. The corner of his mouth moved. "Margaret Hale," he said. "Reese Callahan," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same as he had in the urgent moment of the bank letter crisis, but slower this time and without crisis. And that was the difference that made everything different. She turned her hand over. She held his. Outside, Harrow was quiet in the way of a town after a long week, and the evening was cooling toward autumn, and two people sat at a kitchen table with their hands held, and the world rearranged itself slightly and permanently around that fact. "You know," he said after a while, "I haven't been anywhere long enough to call it home in about 12 years. "I know," she said. "I was starting to think that was just how it was." And now, he looked at her. His eyes were the particular warm dark of a man who was finally in the right place and knew it. "Now I think I was just looking in the wrong direction," he said. She didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. There was just the kitchen and the coffee and his hand in hers, and the very ordinary miracle of two people who had found each other in a town that had tried in its various ways to convince one of them she wasn't worth finding. She had stopped believing that. She was not entirely sure when it had happened. Somewhere between the bank and the lawyer and the settlement and the inventory and 6 frightened people who chose to hold. Somewhere in the accumulated weight of a man who kept coming back. She had stopped believing it, and she had not noticed until just now, sitting quietly in the place she had always been, home. She did not sleep well that night, but it was a different kind of not sleeping than she was used to. The not sleeping that came from fear was tight circular, the same ground covered again and again. This was open. This was the not sleeping of a person whose mind had too much good material and didn't want to lose any of it to unconsciousness. She lay in the dark and thought about the signed settlement, the county filing the railroad survey sitting in the public record where Ezra Whitmore's lawyers couldn't touch it. She thought about Ada's signature on an affidavit, and Carl Brower saying close enough and 7 people in a hardware store back room choosing to hold. She got up at 5 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark before the dawn, and was very quiet with all of it, not speaking to anything, just being still long enough to feel the full weight of what was real. What was real was, she was still here. The store was still here. Ada was going to rebuild. 6 people had held, and a man with a weathered hat and a direct gaze had asked her if she wanted him to stay, and she had said yes, and he had held her hand across her father's table. That was real. She had spent so long being certain that real things would eventually be taken from her, that the leaving was always just a moment away, that the floor under her would shift, that she had nearly missed the moment when real stopped feeling temporary. It had stopped feeling temporary. She sat in her father's kitchen and thought about the letter in the box under the bed, the doctor's letter, the word irreparable, and she thought about what the letter had meant when she first read it. She had read it as a sentence, as the final evidence of a thing she had always half believed, that she was incomplete in some fundamental way, that the world's judgment of her was confirmed by the biology of her own body. She didn't read it that way now. She read it now as a fact, not a sentence. A fact about her physical body, like her brown eyes or the shape of her hands. It was not a verdict on her worth. It was a thing that was true the way many things were true, and it did not cancel the other things that were also true. She was still here. That was also true. She got up and started the day. The first thing Harrow noticed was that Ada's boarding house went back up. Not all at once. It was a frame and a floor and a roof over 6 weeks, the work of hired men and volunteered Saturdays, and Carl Brower showing up on a Tuesday morning with lumber he said he had extra, of which was not true, and everyone knew it and nobody said it. The boarding house went back up the way things went back up in small towns when a community decided collectively and without announcement that something mattered enough to rebuild. Margaret watched it happen from the doorway of her store. She watched it and thought about what Ada had said in the street at 4 in the morning. I am not going to let a man who burns down buildings in the dark get those boards for half price and call it business. She had not said it for effect. She had said it because it was the truest thing she knew at that particular moment, and the town had somehow heard it, even though only 3 people were present, and the town had decided to agree. That was Harrow in the end, slow and opinionated and capable of cruelty, but also capable of this, the quiet decision to stand behind someone expressed through donated lumber and volunteered Saturdays rather than speeches. Reese spent 3 of those Saturdays at the boarding house site. Margaret brought food. It was the most domestic thing they had done together, and it felt natural, in a way she had not expected domesticity to feel, having spent 10 years managing everything alone, and assuming she preferred it that way. She had not preferred it. She had simply not had the alternative. She had the alternative now. It was Lucy Garrett who asked first, which Margaret had known would be the case, because Lucy was the person in Harrow who asked the questions everyone else was already thinking, but considered impolite to voice. She came in on a Wednesday morning in October, ostensibly for coffee beans, and she stood at the counter and looked at Margaret with the particular directness of a woman who had decided not to pretend. "You and Callahan," she said. "Is that a real thing?" "Yes," Margaret said. Lucy nodded, processing. He's staying. Good." Lucy picked up her coffee. "He's a decent man. Lord knows you deserve a decent man." "I'm not sure deserving is how it works," Margaret said. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard you say," Lucy said pleasantly. "Of course it's how it works. You spent years doing right by people who did you wrong. At some point, the arithmetic catches up." She set the coins on the counter. "Keep the change." She left. Margaret stood at the counter with the coins and thought about arithmetic, and whether Lucy was right, and decided that whether she was or wasn't, the result was the same, and the result was enough. What she had not expected was Reese's proposal. Not because she hadn't thought about it. She had, in the careful, peripheral way she thought about things she wanted very much and was afraid of ruining by wanting too directly. She had told herself not to expect it too soon, and certainly not in November, not 4 months after a man with a weathered hat had walked into her store looking for feed and rope. She was doing the accounts when he closed the book. She heard it but didn't look up. "Margaret," he said. Put the ledger down for a minute." She looked up. He was sitting forward in the chair, hands on his knees, wearing the expression he wore when he had made a decision and was implementing it, very similar to his resting expression, except for something deliberate in the set of his jaw. She put the ledger down. "I have been thinking," he said, "about how to say this, for about 3 weeks." "That's a long time to think about how to say something," she said. "It's an important thing," he said. "I wanted to get it right." She waited. "I know you are careful," he said. "I know you do not make decisions fast, and that the decisions you do make, you've thought through from every angle before you commit to them. I know that you are 24 years old, and you have been running your own life since you were 19, and you are very good at it, and you don't need anyone to change that." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking to change it." She kept very still. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because you need a husband. Not because I think anything in your life requires me to complete it. Because I want to spend the rest of my life in the room you're in. Because the time passes fast and I always want it to last longer. Because you are the finest person I have ever known, and I would like the privilege of saying so publicly and permanently." He paused. "That's what I wanted to say. 3 weeks of thinking, and that's what I arrived at." Margaret looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment. That was not hesitation. It was the opposite of hesitation. She was making herself hold the moment long enough to feel the full weight of it, the way she had learned to do with good things, now that she had started believing they were allowed to last. "You said I don't need you to complete my life," she said. "You don't," he said. "I know I don't." She looked at her hands on the ledger, then back at him. "But I want you in it. That's different from needing. I want you in it, Reese. That is—" Her voice caught slightly, which surprised her, and she let it because there was no one here to see it except him, and he had already seen everything she had. "That is a thing I am very certain of." He stood up from the chair. He crossed to the table and went down on one knee on the kitchen floor, which was not something she had expected. She had expected the question without the gesture from him, because the gesture felt like something men did in novels, and he was too practical for novels. But he was down on one knee and looking at her at eye level, and she understood that he was doing it because he wanted her to have it, not because he needed to perform it. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a ring. It was simple, a narrow silver band with a small dark stone garnet, or something close, nothing elaborate. It was not new. It was the kind of ring that had belonged to someone. "This was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me 20 years ago and told me not to give it to anyone who didn't deserve it." He held it out. "She was very specific about that. She said I would know." Margaret looked at the ring. She looked at it for a long time. She was 24 years old, and she had a doctor's letter in a box under her bed with the word irreparable in it, and she had spent 3 months learning to read it as a fact rather than a sentence. But it was still there, still true, and she needed him to know she still carried it. "Reese," she said, "I need to say something first." "All right," he said. He did not lower his hand. "What the letter said," she said, "about children, that is still true. It will always be true. And I need you to tell me, not to reassure me, not to be kind. I need you to tell me truly that you have sat with that, and it does not change what you're asking me." He was quiet for a moment. "I have sat with it," he said. "Since the day you told me. I have thought about it from every direction, and what I know is this: I did not fall in love with you because I was planning a family. I fell in love with you because of who you are, and who you are is not changed by what you can or cannot give me." His voice was steady. "I want a life with you. Whatever that life looks like, I want it." She looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at the bank ledger and the survey document and the settlement papers, with complete attention, looking for the thing that didn't add up the number that was wrong. She could not find it. She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it sitting there. His mother's ring on the hand of a woman who had spent a decade being told she wasn't worth the effort. "Yes," she said. He stood up. He took her face in both hands and kissed her, and it was not theatrical, and it was not brief, and it was the most real thing she had felt in a very long time. When he stepped back, she was still holding on to the front of his coat with both fists, which she hadn't noticed herself doing, and she looked down at her hands gripping the fabric and laughed a real laugh, surprised out of her, and he smiled the full one, the rare one that sounded younger than he was. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. She let go of his coat. She looked at the ring again. "Reese?" she said. "Yes." "Your mother had good taste." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face went very warm and then settled. "She would have liked you," he said. "She would have liked you a great deal." They told people the next morning, which meant Harrow found out by noon. Mrs. Pendleton cried in the store, which was not surprising. She had been steering toward this outcome since approximately their second supper, and considered herself a contributing factor, which was not accurate, but was kind to leave unchallenged. Carl Brower shook Reese's hand with both of his and said, "About time," to which Reese said, "4 months." And Carl said, "I said what I said." Tom Calloway heard the news through Jensen and came by the store that afternoon. He stood at the counter and looked at Margaret with the lined, patient face of a man who had seen a lot of things and was glad to see this one. "Congratulations, Margaret," he said. "Thank you, Tom. He's a good man." "I know," she said. Tom nodded. He bought a bag of flour he did not need and left. Ada came home that evening and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the ring and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your father would have approved." Margaret looked at her. "You knew my father. Everyone in Harrow knew your father." Ada picked up her coffee. "He came in my dining room every Thursday for 15 years. Ordered the same thing every time. Pot roast, no gravy, extra bread." She paused. "He talked about you all the time. Said you were the sharpest mind in Teller County, and the town just hadn't figured it out yet." Margaret was quiet. She had not heard that. She had not known that. "He was right," Ada said simply, and went to bed. Margaret sat at the kitchen table for a long time, after that in the quiet with the ring on her finger, and her father's words in her chest, and the knowledge that he had seen her. The real her. The sharp-minded, careful, determined her, and had been waiting patiently for the rest of the world to catch up. He had not been wrong. The rest of the world was catching up. The twist came in January from a direction none of them had anticipated. It came in the form of a letter from Everett Cross, who had returned to Casper after the settlement, but had kept following threads the way lawyers did. What he had found at the end of one of those threads changed the shape of the whole story. He wrote that he had been reviewing the primary railroad survey finally released through the public records request, and in reviewing it, He had found something. The right-of-way corridor had been amended. Quietly, 8 months prior to Margaret's records request in a county land office filing that had not been publicized. The amendment shifted the northern terminus of the corridor, not dramatically, just 200 yards. But 200 yards in that particular direction meant that 3 of the 6 properties Meridian had acquired were now outside the right-of-way zone. Meridian had paid right-of-way premium prices for land that was no longer in the right-of-way. Cross wrote, "I believe the original survey was presented to Meridian's investors as accurate at the time of acquisition, and the subsequent amendment was either unknown to them or was discovered and suppressed." Either way, Meridian's investors paid inflated prices for property that does not carry the access rights they were promised. This creates a separate fraud exposure that has nothing to do with the property sellers. This is a dispute internal to Whitmore's own operation. He added at the bottom, "I thought you should know." Margaret read the letter twice. Then she handed it to Reese across the breakfast table. He read it. He set it down. He looked at the table for a moment. "He defrauded his own investors," Reese said. "It looks that way," Margaret said. "Does Cross think Whitmore knew about the amendment?" "He doesn't say. Either Whitmore knew and suppressed it, or someone in his operation knew and didn't tell him." She looked at the letter. "Either way, it's not your problem," Reese said. She looked at him. "It's not," he said. "You won your fight, Margaret. You got the disclosure, the settlement, the acknowledgement. What happens inside Whitmore's business dealings with his own investors is between him and them." She looked at the letter. "I know," she said. "But," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "But Ada's affidavit is still on file. And if there's an internal dispute inside Whitmore's operation, and if someone decides to cooperate with a broader inquiry, then Ada's case gets new legs," he said, "without any effort from us." She looked at him. "I'm going to send this to Ada and let her decide if she wants to share it with her own lawyer. And then I'm going to close this drawer and not open it again unless someone asks me to." He was quiet. Then, "That's the right call." "I know," she said. "I've made a lot of right calls lately. I'm getting used to the feeling." He looked at her. "Don't get too comfortable," he said. And there was something in it that was humor and also genuine. The reminder that ease was not permanent, that life would find new ways to be difficult, and that she would handle those too. "I won't," she said. She sent Cross's letter to Ada that afternoon. 2 weeks later, Ada came to supper and said quietly, "My lawyer is interested," and nothing more was said about it because that was how things worked. Now the threads moved at their own pace, and she did not have to pull every one of them. They married in April. Not a large wedding. The ceremony happened at the courthouse with Cross, who had ridden down from Casper because Margaret had written to him and he had come, and Lucy Garrett and Carl and Ada and Tom Calloway, who delayed his departure for Ohio by 1 week for reasons he said had nothing to do with the wedding and everything to do with a business matter that coincidentally resolved itself the morning after. Margaret wore a dress she had made herself over the winter blue, the color of early morning, because she was not wearing dark colors anymore. She had stopped wearing dark colors in November quietly and without announcement, and no one had said a word about it, and she had noticed that no one said a word about it, and that noticing was its own kind of answer. Reese wore his good coat and had his hair cut, which she found enormously endearing, and told him so, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her face, at what was actually there, and said, "You look beautiful." And she believed him. She believed him completely, which was the thing. Not him, her. She looked in the mirror the morning of her wedding and saw a woman she recognized, broad-shouldered and full-figured and brown-eyed and 24 years old, and she did not angle sideways or check whether the color made her look smaller. She put on the blue dress and picked up her coat and went to marry the man who had fixed her fence because it needed fixing. The ceremony was brief. The words were said, the papers signed. At the moment they were pronounced married, Ada pressed Margaret's hand once hard and let go. Margaret held Reese's hand. She had a very clear thought standing in the Harrow courthouse in the blue dress, "I am still here." The same thought she had had in the street the morning of Ada's fire, and the morning after the bank letter, and the evening she had read the doctor's letter for the 5th time. and approximately every other moment in the last 10 years, when the world had tried to convince her that she was too much or not enough, or simply in the wrong shape to matter. She was still here. She had always been here. She was just finally the only one in the room who remembered that. The months that followed were the most ordinary of Margaret's life, which was the point. She ran the store. She kept the books. She extended credit to the Kowalski family and made a note in the column she kept for such things. She hired a boy named Eli to help with the heavier loading, because Reese took on the management of Carl's operation and was gone certain mornings, and she needed the help, and she did not feel guilty for needing help, which was new. She and Reese had supper together in the evenings. They talked and did not talk. She did the accounts while he read, and sometimes she looked up, and he was already looking at her, and they did not make a production of that either. Ada's boarding house opened in May. The dining room was larger than before, which Ada said was an accident of the rebuild, and which no one believed. On opening day, she served pot roast, no gravy, extra bread, not on the regular menu to anyone who wanted it. Margaret ordered it. She sat at a table in Ada's new dining room and ate pot roast the way her father had ordered it every Thursday for 15 years, and thought about him saying she was the sharpest mind in Teller County, and thought about how long it had taken her to begin to believe that, and thought about how much faster it might have gone if one person had told her sooner. She decided she would be that person for someone else. She did not know yet who or when, but she knew the shape of what it meant to be seen at the right moment by the right person, and she had more years ahead than behind her, and she intended to use them. In October, a year from the first real cold that had crept under her door, while Reese read by the lamp, and she did accounts, Margaret stood in her store on a Tuesday morning and watched Harrow go about its business through the window. She thought about a fence on the creek side and a man who fixed it because it needed fixing. She thought about 6 people in a back room choosing to hold. She thought about the word irreparable in a doctor's letter and how long it had taken her to understand that it was a fact about her body and not a verdict on her life. She thought about her father telling the Thursday dinner crowd that his daughter was the sharpest mind in the county, and the way she had never known that, and the way knowing it now felt like a door she had not realized was closed, swinging open on a room that had always been there. Reese came in at noon with his hat and his coat and his direct gaze, and he came behind the counter because that was normal now, and he put a hand briefly on the back of her neck, because that was also normal now, and he looked at what she was looking at through the window. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She considered. "My father," she said. "And the word irreparable, and a fence on the creek side." She paused. "And the fact that I spent 10 years being certain I wasn't worth the effort, and then I was, and now I'm not certain of that anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "Not the uncertainty," he said. "The certainty. Which one are you not certain of anymore?" She looked at him sideways. "The one where I wasn't worth it," she said. "I'm not certain of that one anymore." He held her gaze. "Good," he said. Just that. Just the plain word, the way she had said thank you to him the first time, no decoration, no performance. Just the thing itself. She turned back to the window. Outside, Harrow moved through its Tuesday. A rider she didn't recognize came down Main Street and tied his horse and stood for a moment looking at the town the way strangers did, measuring it, deciding what kind of place it was. She knew what kind of place it was. She knew it better than she ever had, its narrowness and its generosity and its long memory and its capacity when the arithmetic caught up to stand behind someone who deserved standing behind. She was Margaret Hale, Margaret Callahan now, though she had kept Hale on the store sign because her father had built the sign, and she was not sentimental about much, but she was sentimental about that. She was the woman who ran the dry goods store on Main Street, who extended credit quietly and kept books cleanly, and had once thrown a jar of molasses 12 feet and hit her target. The woman who had stood in front of a bank with her ledgers and made a man reverse a decision made under pressure, who had organized 6 frightened people into a legal action in a hardware store back room. She was the woman who had been told in 100 ways by 100 people that she was too much or not enough or in the wrong shape to matter. She was still here. That was not something anyone had given her. That was something she had always been. She had just finally stopped arguing with it. Yad. She thought about that for a moment longer, the stopping arguing with it, and then a customer came in, and she turned from the window and helped them find what they needed, and rang them up and sent them on their way. Then she went back to the accounts. Reese went to make coffee without being asked. The two cats sat in their respective corners and ignored each other with great dedication. The store was warm and ordered. The books were clean, and across town, Ada's boarding house dining room was serving lunch, and a woman who had pressed her hand flat on an affidavit and rebuilt her life board by board was feeding people who came in from the cold. This was not a small thing. None of it was a small thing. Margaret had spent years thinking in terms of smallness. Small house, small store, small life, small woman, made smaller by years of being told to take up less space. She did not think in those terms anymore. Her life was not small. It was exactly the right size. When Reese came back with the coffee, she took the cup from him and looked at him. Really looked the way she had learned to look at things she was allowed to keep. And he looked back the same way, and neither of them said anything because the thing between them did not require saying. It had never required saying. That was the thing about true things. They were true before anyone spoke them. They had always been there. You just had to stop running long enough to notice. She had stopped running. She was here. She was worth every step of the way. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything she had always already been.